Hello students, welcome again. Students, in our previous video lecture, we discussed Alexander Pope as a poet. As you know now that there had been a kind of controversy whether Alexander Pope was truly a poet or not, that we discussed in our previous video lecture. But today our focus mainly is to discuss Alexander Pope as an important representative poet of the 18th century. We will also discuss Pope as a neoclassical poet, Pope as a great satirist of the 18th century, and we will also have a look at some of the important characteristics of Pope's poetry. So now let's begin. To begin with, let me quote this critique, M.Phil. M.Phil has appreciated the works of Alexander Pope and said that Pope gave to his age the kind of poetry it needed. This means that Pope has contributed to English literature the kind of poetry which was the demand of the time of the 18th century readers, 18th century society. Okay. Now we know that John Dryden has rightly once said that every age has one genius who becomes the representative literary personality of his age. John Dryden himself was the representative poet of the 17th century. In the same manner, Geoffrey Chaucer has been considered as the representative poet of the 14th century, and in the same manner, most of the critics believe that Alexander Pope was the genius of his age and he becomes the representative poet of the 18th century, particularly the first half of the 18th century. Representative means, the poet who represents the spirit of his age. Now, the question is, what was the spirit of Alexander Pope's age? That we will discuss in detail, and how this spirit is reflected in his poetry, that we will discuss. So first of all, let me introduce you to the important works written by Alexander Pope. As you can see on the screen, an essay on criticism, the rape of the lock, the Dunciad, an essay on man. These are some important works, literary works written by Alexander Pope during the first half of the 18th century, and he is known by these important works. Okay. Now, if you think about 18th century, what kind of people or what kind of society do you find in England? If you examine the whole history of England and the whole history of English literature, you will find that it was the period of classicism, or you can say it was the period of neoclassicism. Okay, so this spirit of neoclassicism has been well represented by Alexander Pope in his poetry, and that's why we consider Alexander Pope as an important classical poet or neoclassical poet or the representative poet. Okay, now what is classicism? Classicism means when the writers, they start imitating the ancient classical writers like Virgil, like Homer. Okay, so in his prose style, if you examine Alexander Pope, and when we read his prose literature, we feel that he is actually indebted to Greece and Rome. Why? Because he has adopted the style of writing from the Greek poets like Homer and Virgil, even in his poetry. Okay, it became the important object or aim of Alexander Pope to introduce the kind of language and versification which was very much popular among the ancient Greek writers. Okay, and that's why, because he was the follower of these ancient Greek writers, that's why we consider him as a neoclassical poet. Why neoclassical? New classicism was introduced during 18th century, and that's why it is called neoclassicism. Moreover, classicism also includes correctness and finish, as you can see on the screen. Alexander Pope's poetry, you find this characteristic in his poetry. Okay, his poetry is mainly characterized by correctness and finish. Okay, his aim as a poet was to become a writer of a complete finished work. Okay, while writing his poetry, he was so much conscious about expressing his thoughts that his thoughts they do not come spontaneously. If I use the words of William Wordsworth, you remember Wordsworth said that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Okay, according to Wordsworth, the thoughts, the feelings come naturally, effortless in a poet. But Alexander Pope was not that kind of a poet, right? He made deliberate attempts to bring thoughts from his mind, okay, and to present them for the readers, and he gives proper shape and proper meaning by writing and rewriting, by thinking and thinking. He makes so many drafts, and then he comes to the perfection, then he comes to the correctness and finish. He examined each line, each word of his poetry with minute observation. He rearranged every word and every line in his poetry with great patience and clarity. And in his preface to the Rape of the Lock, he himself has said that I corrected because it was as pleasant to me to correct as to write. So for Alexander Pope, it is as pleasant an experience to write poetry as to rewrite the poetry. So he writes and rewrites. He corrects his writings on his own, and then he writes the final draft of his poetry. So correctness and finish is one of the important characteristics of Alexander Pope's poetry. Another important feature of the 18th century was the love for satire. Satire was the device used by major writers of the 18th century, and Pope is considered as the representative poet of the 18th century. Why? Because his poetry is also full of satire. 18th century was the period of satire. Okay, Alexander Pope is considered as one of the greatest satirists of the entire English poetry, not only of the 18th century, but the whole English poetry. Alexander Pope he achieves an important place as a great satirist during the 18th century. Now the question is, why Pope had so much love for satire? Then the answer is that he was, he had some physical deformity. He was a very short-heighted fellow, and because of his short height, because of his physical deformity, he was so many times insulted by the people around him. So, anyhow, he wanted to take a revenge against those insults done to him when he was a child. So in his personal life, this deformity of his personal life makes him a great satirist who starts laughing at the people, who starts laughing at the society by writing his satirical poems. Pope himself has said these lines. He said that satire is my weapon. He uses satire as a weapon to fight against the people, to laugh at the people. Okay, satire is my weapon, but I am too discreet, I am too wise. He says that I am so wise to run amok. He runs so wild, he goes wild against the people and tilt at all I meet. Tilt means to strike, to blow. He blows at the people with great courage and with great confidence by using his weapon of satire. That is what Alexander Pope himself said. Okay, Pope was a writer of wild satire. He wrote both personal satire and impersonal satire. Personal satire means he attacks the the particular people who are living in his times, and he has written impersonal satires also. That means he laughs at the society in general. So both types of satires are written by him. He has boldly laughed at the corruption of the high officers in his times. Okay, Pope comes out as an impersonal satirist when he ridicules the whole woman class in his very important work Rape of the Lock. Here it is called impersonal satire, means he does not laugh at one particular woman. Here he laughs at the whole womankind, okay, whole class of women who were living in England during the 18th century. So Rape of the Lock is an example of the impersonal satire. Here he showed to the world that all women are shallow by nature and they are merely interested in love making. That is what he has presented in his Rape of the Lock. If you read another work, The Dunciad, there you find some personal satires. Personal satires means he attacks one particular person who was living in his times. Okay, the Dunciad is a nice example of this personal satire. Here he laughs at Theobald, he laughs at Bentley, he laughs at Seaborg. Okay, these were the writers who were writing literature during the 18th century. He attacks those writers, he attacks those writing for producing some bad kind of literature. Okay, the satires of Pope have an acid-like power, right? Acid, you can say, acid is very powerful, it can burn anything. So you can compare satires of Alexander Pope with acid. It has acid-like power to create a deep wound in the hearts of the persons concerned. Okay, in this respect, Pope can never be placed lower than John Dryden and Jonathan Swift. If someone asks you a question, who are the greatest satirists of English literature, then three names remember, and they are Alexander Pope, John Dryden and Jonathan Swift. These were the three great satirists of English literature who lived during the 17th and 18th century. Okay, what about Pope's poetic techniques? What kind of poetry he was writing or how he was writing? Okay, then the answer is his best use of heroic couplets. Pope was not a poet like William Wordsworth or Astor Coleridge or P.B. Shelley, John Keats. He was a different kind of a poet. Instead of rhythm, emotions, imagination, imagery, instead of all these things, Pope introduces what? We find in his poetry reason. Reason means, intellect. He gives more importance to correctness, to finish, to proper order, reason, intellect, wit, and thoughts. Okay, so his poetry does not appeal our heart, unlike the romantic poets like William Wordsworth, Coleridge, and all. Okay, his poetry appeals the mind, the intellect, the wit of mankind. So that is the basic difference between a common poet, other romantic poets of the 19th century, and Alexander Pope. Okay, he is a great master of heroic couplets. What is a heroic couplet? Heroic couplet means a stanza of two iambic pentameter lines which are rhyming with each other. Okay, so that is called heroic couplet. This heroic couplet was first successfully used by Geoffrey Chaucer during the 14th century. Later on, Alexander Pope became the great master of using heroic couplets in his poetry. Okay, it is mostly used in narrative or descriptive kind of poetry. His technique of writing poetry, as I told you, is different from other writers. Why? Because he does not, his poetry is not a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, what Wordsworth believed. Instead of that, we can say Alexander Pope's poetry is an organized expression of thoughts as presented, as said by T.S. Eliot. So he was a follower. He goes in the line of T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot said that true poetry is the organized expression of thoughts, okay, and experiences. So that is what we find in his poetry. He writes and rewrites. So all in all, we can say that Alexander Pope was indeed a true representative poet. Why? Because if you examine the 18th century poetry, 18th century society in England, it was the period of reason, it was the period of neoclassicism, it was the period of intellect, wit and satire, and all these things are very well expressed, are very well found in Alexander Pope's poetry. The correctness, finish, precision, exactness, satire, okay, heroic couplets, appeal to intellect, all this is called neoclassicism, and that we find in his poetry, and that's why critics call him as a neoclassical poet. That's why scholars call him as the representative poet of the 18th century. Okay, he appeals more to the intellect and less to the heart. Okay, there is a debate, as I discussed in my previous video, there is a debate whether Alexander Pope was a great prose writer or a great poet, but we don't want to enter into that debate. We don't want to enter into that controversy, but in short, we can say that he was a poet and he was a great representative neoclassical poet who writes satirical poems. At the end, let me recall Lord Byron, who himself was a great poet. Okay, he also appreciated Alexander Pope and said that as to Pope, I have always regarded him as the greatest name in our poetry. According to Byron, he considers the name of Alexander Pope as one of the greatest names. Okay, depend upon it, the rest are barbarians. That means he wants to say you agree with this idea and all other poets are the barbarians. If you do not agree with this idea, you are a barbarian. Barbarian means an uncivilized man. Okay, so being a civilized man, let's salute Alexander Pope's contribution to English poetry. So friends, here we come to the end of this topic, and if you have any doubts or questions, do write to me in the comment section of this channel, and please do share this video among all your friends and classmates so that others also can be benefited. Thank you for watching. Thank you.